Welcome to our panelists and attendees, and thank you to Biographers International, especially Michael Gately and Linda Level for this extraordinary conference. My name is Nicholas Boggs. I am the moderator for this panel, Biography Hacks, Tips and Tricks of the Trade. Although I did not conceive this panel, I confess that as soon as the organizers asked me to moderate it, I was very excited. Since I'm halfway through my first biography, I feel I have much to learn myself. But then as I started to look at the description, I started to think, is this idea of the panel a kind of fantasy, a collective one on the part of biographers, or at least for myself, that there are tricks or shortcuts or hacks, that anything really that can somehow make this daunting task of writing a biography quicker, easier, or just make it feel doable. And while I suspect that there's no quick fix per se, I do know that we have panelists today who I'm sure have a sort of, or I'm hoping, a set of practices, research and writing practices that they return to again and again, and perhaps in different ways in their illustrious careers. So I was thinking in terms of structure, after I introduced them, that we would spend about 10 minutes on these three sort of areas. And the first would be writing, tips for research, since that's where it begins, then tips for writing, and then 3 tips, to borrow the language of the panel description, for, quote, gracefully bringing it all together in the end, with the caveat, of course, that all of these categories overlap and bleed into each other, I'm sure. And in fact, one of the things that I'm personally interested in is exactly how that process works for all of them. And I have some questions about that. Please note that at the end, there's many people here, and I'm sure there's going to be many questions. So we will reserve at least 15 minutes to get to your questions. Please go ahead and put them in the chat, and I will do my best to get to as many of them as possible, or to collate them into a kind of a thread of questions that are consistent. Okay, so introductions will be short, since these are illustrious figures and you have their bios in the conference description. But David Maraniss is a journalist, a historian, and a biographer who won the Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of Bill Clinton in the Washington Post. And he has written many books, including biographies of Barack Obama, Vince Lombardi, and a new one, Path Lit by Lightning, The Life of the Olympian Jim Thorpe, which is forthcoming in August from Simon & Schuster. Stacy Schiff won the Pulitzer Prize for Vera, Mrs. Vladimir Nabokov, and her biography of Cleopatra, a personal favorite of mine, and her book, The Witches, about the Salem witch trials, were both #1 bestsellers. It's also worth noting that she's a stalwart member of Bio and serves on the advisory council right now. Douglas Brinkley is a professor of history at Rice and a presidential historian for both CNN and the New York Historical Society. He's written numerous best-selling books, and these books include biographies of Franklin Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, Walter Cronkite, and also nonfiction books about Hurricane Katrina, and most recently, American Moonshot, John F. Kennedy and the Great Space Race. Welcome, all of you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Nicholas.
So I'm just going to start with part 1, tips and approaches to research. Perhaps we'll start with you, David. I just have a general question about if you have tips for research, but I think folks might be particularly curious about what you intriguingly call your, quote, 4 legs of the table process.
I once called it 3 legs of a stool, and my wife didn't like that, so I added a 4th one. I'll just talk about the first one because that's the most, well, 2 of them are important to the research part of your question. But the first one is go there, wherever there is. And I've tried to devote all of my books to actually living in the places that I write about, or at least spending so much time there that I feel that I'm living there. When I did the Vince Lombardi biography, I turned to my wife and said, how would you like to move to Green Bay for the winter? To which she responded, "Brr," but we did it. And it made all the difference in so many different ways. Not only to feel what it's like to live in a 1-company town, which was the Green Bay Packers, but also to survive a winter with the Saskatchewan Screamers and the Alberta Clippers up there in Green Bay. And finally, I found so many people that I never would have come across any other way. I was there for a week when the Green Bay Press Gazette ran a story saying that Clinton's biographer is in Green Bay area, and they ran my telephone number, my local number. And I literally got hundreds of calls from people who had different types of stories, you know, whether it was the the newspaper kid who delivered Lombardi's papers and was scared to death that he would answer the door, to the piano player at a supper club who would have to play the songs for Marie Lombardi when they walked in the door, all of that type of stuff. So going there is the first leg of my table, and the others I'll get to later, but I'll let the others talk too.
All right, great. Well, we'll stand on that one leg for now. We'll be back for the next one. Stacy, I remember at one of these events, it was a few years ago, when you were talking about your research, and you said something, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you said that when you, at least when you begin, you don't read prior biographies of your subjects, and that fascinated me. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that, but also about tips for your research in general.
I mean, I couldn't second what David said more heartily. I mean, you can't write about that. I mean, first of all, you have to hope that the place to which you go still exists, which it doesn't always. So it's easier to recreate, the desert where Saint-Exupéry flew than it is to recreate the desert in which Cleopatra was exiled, just because it isn't there anymore, so to speak. So yeah, part of that is the not wanting to be influenced by a prior biographer's assumptions. And if I'm working from the same set of primary materials as somebody else, I don't really want their interpolation. I want to go directly to those materials. Obviously, that falls apart for secondary characters. If you have, for your subject's letters, obviously you want to be in direct communication with your subject. If someone has a walk-on role in the book, I'm probably not going to read his original correspondence in a library, especially if it involves travel. So there, I always certainly resort to the secondary sources. But I feel like your first stop if you're writing about someone of the 20th century or the 21st century, is the survivors. And obviously, in an ideal world, you would see the eldest ones first. I've never managed to do that. You always lose someone along the way, it seems to me. But then to really go back to the primary sources as early and then as often as you can, because for me anyway, and I suspect that David and Doug are better about this, I don't always know what I'm looking for when first I look at those papers. And I end up reading them once at the outset to ground myself, and then again with a thorough understanding of the context and the subject and the cast of characters at which certain things jump out at you that absolutely were inert on the page during the first reading.
Great, thank you. Sort of relatedly, David, you've written presidential biographies, but they often have
Doug.
I'm sorry, Doug, yes. But they often have particular approaches and focuses. So I'm wondering how that impacts your research. And do you begin with that focus, or is that something that emerges in the process of your research?
I think kind of what Stacy was saying, each biography is different. Depends if it's somebody recent or contemporary. I was Rosa Parks's biographer, and I would go and spend time with her in Montgomery and Washington and California and Detroit and try to capture her essence because she was alive, in addition to going to her papers at Wayne State University or visiting Dr. and Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King's papers at Boston University, et cetera. So, if it's in 19, but and then what I really liked what David said was that you go to the place. There used to be a writer, James Chase. No reason we remember James Chase much. He wrote some books, but he once told me when I was young, go to Haiti, meaning get on the plane and go. Don't talk about going. If you're going to write a book on Bob Dylan, go to Hibbing, Minnesota, go to Duluth, where he grew up. If you're writing on Lombardi, go to Green Bay. If you're writing on Truman, go to Independence, go to his birthplace. Because I think there's a lot of a real sense of place in people's lives. And you can, if we're lucky, capture some of that. So I can't urge enough. And then I tend to believe to start just collecting on the figure. If you're writing on Jim Thorpe, my way would be to get anything I can on Jim Thorpe, what's been out there. I look at everything from children's books to articles. Maybe you end up going into a morgue of Sports Illustrated that might have a few articles, or go back to an old New York Times, articles, and then print a file of here's what the Times have said over the decades about Thorpe, and accumulate as much material as you can. And the question is really then one of interviewing. You can't go interview people from Cleopatra's era, but you can go interview Cleopatra experts, or go to the Cleopatra Society dinner, or get to know some key people that are going to be important perhaps to proofread your manuscript in the end. I mean, I find that writing a biography is you might be writing about one person, but you're really, it's a collective endeavor, but between archives and scholars and sharing your chapters to people, getting other ideas far and wide. I do think Stacy and David are two of our best biographers I'm on here with. So they're able to be, I consider them both great creative artists. If you're on this panel listening, this may be you're working on your first biography. Maybe you got to be careful that you don't overassume or what an artist you are and flash around in different ways. If you're really good, that's great. But a safe plan B, and maybe it should be your plan A, is abandon chronology at your own peril. People live their life week by week by week by week by week. All of us, everybody on the Zoom does. So I want to know the timeline in my mind of that biographical figure early on. I'd like to be able to, if I could put a little, almost monitor where I know what they're doing every month of their life, if that's possible. Some people it is, some it isn't, but I try, because then I have a timeline, I have a spine. And if I then keep the chronology going, I can then go off and write on riffs on different topics, but at least I have that backbone of chronology. If you're really good, you don't need to do that. You put your, the funeral scene, Edmund Morris, before he passed in his last Edison book, started writing the book backwards from death to birth. And there are all sorts of creative ways to do a biography. But if it's your first book, I don't make sure you have that chronology down, because you don't want to lose the reader with your switchbacks.
If I can just build on what you just said, Doug, I've always had a sort of crazy chronology, because you see such unusual overlap, which you wouldn't otherwise have noticed. And it's often the thing that allows you to make a narrative leap, or not make a leap, but make just a nice mincing step, because you don't realize how these things were related otherwise. But when they fall on top of each other, when you realize that during the same week, this person arrived and that person left, you begin to see cause and effect, which otherwise would not have been obvious to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree too. And, I'm old school. I still use 3-ring binders for most of my material.
Me too.
But at least 7 of them are just pure chronology. And I use the phrase freedom through discipline for what you're talking about, Doug. The discipline is the chronology, which is the skeleton of your book. And if you have that down, if you really have the chronology mastered, that allows you the freedom within that to go off on different riffs when they're appropriate. And so that's what I love to do, but always with the foundation of the chronology.
That's so interesting. The timeline does seem crucial. And my next question is sort of related to where you guys are heading. How does the research influence the structure of the biography? I mean, do you know how you're, in terms of the chapters or sections, do you have a sense of how your long chapters, short chapters, et cetera? Do you have a sense of how your biography is going to be structured before you go? Do you do the research based on that, or does that structure kind of organically emerge from the research process? Maybe Stacy first.
I always set out to write short chapters, and I always write long chapters. So there you have it. No, I slavishly and stupidly do the research first, almost in its entirety, before I set down to write, because I've never figured out how otherwise to plot a book, or for that matter, to figure out where the critical mass is, or I don't really know my own thinking until I've done the research. So, and really until I feel I have my arms around the material, only then do I begin to write. And yes, of course, the material structure is where you're going. I mean, Cleopatra is a perfect example. You have these bald spots, and you have to somehow, wheedle your way around them and hope that no one's going to notice. And that, on the other hand, you then discover that there are whole areas where you have riches you never expected to find, and you end up sort of detouring for those areas. So, I do think the old adage of, you go where the research takes you is, fundamentally true to what we do. And you don't want to stint on those great bodies of research. They're like oases in the wilderness, really. But I could never figure out how to plot a book in advance of having really sort of bathed in the material for years.
How about you, Douglas?
It is a great idea, whatever your book is, to get to know the archivist. But the predetermining some things when you start a book, like Doris Kearns Goodwin's a great example. She started writing a book on FDR and it suddenly became about FDR and Eleanor. She started writing a book on Theodore Roosevelt and it really morphed into being TR in journalism and press lords, and then into the Bull Moose Party. I'm just now finishing, I'll be out in November, a book called Silent Spring Revolution on John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and the Great Environmental Awakening. That was my original idea. But so I was really going to do the 60s environmental movement. Mm-hmm. But the more when I got into it, I realized I couldn't start it in 61 like I thought, because it's all about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's about the nuclear age and about the 1950s protesting about nuclear testing and the way we were blowing up atomic weapons willy-nilly in the Nevada testing range, and how Barry Commoner was finding people were getting sick, and that influenced Rachel Carson in the 50s. And so I suddenly now had to abandon beginning at Kennedy, go back to starting with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then, okay, well, that made my book longer. And then I realized there's no way I can end it with Lyndon Johnson and Stuart Udall, the Interior Secretary, leaving, because Nixon did so much. And meaning Nixon's only president 8 days, and I had the Santa Barbara oil spill. And that was a big event in early 69. And then it's like, well, then the Cuyahoga River caught fire. And then Nixon created NEPA. And then Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency. And then he signed the Clean Air Act. And then he signed the Clean Water Act. And then he did Endangered Species Act. Nixon got so large. So now I had to expand the book on the back end, because I couldn't let the reader, I had to tell, and I realized the 60s was a kind of a long 60s of a rejection of chemicals and the abuse of the land after World War II from 45 to 73. Once Nixon gone, things changed for a bunch of reasons. The point being, this book, my parameter that I had told HarperCollins my book is got blown up on both ends. And it's just a fatter book now, which is a good thing because it's thorough, but it's a bad thing because shipping costs a lot. And I'm about to encounter a lot of doorstop jokes come the fall.
It's true. The 60s feels like at least 2 decades when one tries to write about it. I'm looking at the time, and as we transition towards writing, David, I'm wondering, back to your 4-legged table model, is there part of it that relates to this transition from the research to the writing?
The 4-legged table are mostly about research, actually. They're go there, get the documents, interview as many people as you can. And the fourth one somewhat does, which is look for what's not there. As both Stacy and Doug were saying, there are certain mythologies that are built up over time. That's why Stacy doesn't want to necessarily read the other books beforehand. And you don't want to get trapped in that. You don't want to get trapped in people telling the same story over and over again. So I always am looking for what's not there. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Barack Obama, in his wonderful memoir, talks about, his mother married an Indonesian as well as a Kenyan. And in the Indonesian part of the story, he says that his Indonesian grandfather died heroically fighting the Dutch in the War for Independence. Now that's the story. And everybody reported that and wrote about it over and over again. And it turns out when I went to Indonesia, I discovered that the grandfather died of a heart attack falling off an ottoman changing the drapes. So there are always these, that's a small myth. There are big myths and small myths, but I'm always trying to avoid getting trapped in any of those myths. And really, it's a large part of what we do as biographers, is try to find the real story behind that. That didn't quite answer your question about writing, but I'll get to that if you want me to, but I don't want to take up too much time.
No, thank you. You have to get through the research, or at least far into the research, I assume, before you start writing. But that's part of my question. As we turn to the writing, Stacy, I believe you write in notebooks longhand first.
I know, how embarrassing is that, right?
Not at all. It's amazing.
I write on a yellow legal pad with a pencil. And just to David's point, the worst part is a subject who's actually written about him or herself eloquently. I mean, Ben Franklin as much as a Barack Obama, because you have to get past the long established concretized myth. And it's really hard to go up against somebody else who's laid down a pretty substantial myth. I read on yellow legal pads, mostly probably because I always have, and therefore I'm a little superstitious about it, but largely because I'm a super fast typist. And I don't think as fast as I type. And the writing, the actual physical pencil on the paper slows me down, which I like to think is a good thing. I think we all tend to type well and therefore write long these days. I do wonder if there's a connection between how fat books have become and how easy it is to type. So it's just been a long time habit of, with a pencil, you have an eraser. And somehow the physical, the satisfaction of the mechanical connection with the paper is just, part of for me, it's one of the few, it's one of the things that actually I enjoy. It's a sensual piece of the process.
It's interesting, Stacey, because Robert Caro, of course, uses an electric typewriter, and he does it for the same reason that you use your hand. He says he goes too fast if he
That's interesting.
Stacey, I handwrite all my books.
I'm feeling so much better. You both have been so lovely. Thank you.
There were a lot of great writers. Norman Mailer used to handwrite all of his stuff, and then you read the draft the next day. But I was I noticed one of the people writing in, a friend of mine, biographer Susan Page, and she writes incredible. She's doing a book on Barbara Walters coming up, and I was just 48 hours ago at Sarah Lawrence, where Barbara Walters went to school, and they were abuzz about Susan doing this biography. And they just opened a Barbara Walters Center up there. And it dawns me, one advice to biographers of contemporary people, not just go there, but kind of become part of the alum group. I was at a table where everybody had these Barbara Walters stories flying at me about her family and her kids. And I thought about Susan, thinking, God, if she were here, this is like a smorgasbord of great material, And I do think it matters how soon I write in contemporary America, 20th century, 21st, you can still find the children of people. I think what era your biography is going to matter. For if you're doing more, like David just mentioned Obama and Bill Clinton, then you can still get to people that knew them. And then having a journalistic instinct like Susan has for all these years really will serve as her ally when she writes her Barbara Walters book.
Well, you're Douglas and Stacey, you're both in good company. James Baldwin also wrote longhand on legal pads. So.
Hey, which book are you doing? I missed what you're writing.
A biography of James Baldwin.
I thought so. Yeah. Great. Boy, that'll be fantastic.
Thank you. Before, one question that I think people ask a lot about this transition from research to writing is a basic one, which is, when do you stop researching and start writing? How do you know that it's time to actually put pen to paper or finger to key?
Well, first of all, you never stop researching. All of my books, I've actually done reporting the last week before I turn the book in. But I mean, all of us will have a different rhythm. My books generally take 3 to 4 years. And I probably spend the first 2 years just researching. And then I sort of know the parameters of the book, but it's only when I start writing that I realize where it's going. I mean, I have a friend, Rick Atkinson, who's a wonderful war writer, books, and he has outlines that are longer than his books. I taught his outline once at Princeton. I mean, it's incredible, but I'm not like that. My outlines are generally about, for a chapter, maybe 1 page on a yellow notebook. And then I let the magic of the writing process take shape along with all of my 3-ring binders. So I would say about 2 years in, I start writing, and particularly because once that creative process starts, I realized that the book is going to go places that I didn't know it was going to go. And then I do more research all the way to the end.
I think there always turns out to be that sort of pothole where you forgot to research or you didn't know you were going to want to go there.
Yes.
And you end up, I remember my first book sort of hitting myself in the head and thinking, good God, I don't know what it was like to live in Paris during World War I. World War II, yes. World War I, not at all. And having to go back. So there is that always that sense of, and I research until the book is published. I mean, I'm that horrible writer who's actually sending, edits to the publisher in, second pass proofs.
Thanks for calling me horrible, Stacy.
Oh, you too. A support group has been formed.
Yes, you speaking as an old editor from the publishing world.
They're going to send us to reform school, clearly. Yeah. But now I'm just going to say, well, Doug Brinkley does it all the time.
Please don't tell him that.
I have a question, David, and this is for all of you, but David, you said that, quote, the art of the biographer requires a jeweler's eye.
No, I didn't say it.
You didn't say it?
No, Jane Levy said it. It was a blurb for my next book.
Oh, okay.
But go ahead, read it.
This has been said of you then. A birder's ear, the tenacity of a cold case detective, and the curiosity of the great explorers. How does this translate into the writing process? I mean,
Well, certainly the ear translates into the writing process. I mean, as much as my books are entirely fact-based, what I really love about the writing process is the rhythm. I believe deeply in the rhythm of a sentence and a paragraph and a chapter and a whole book. There's something magical about that is really the reason I write. And so that requires, I guess the jewelers, I mean, I didn't write that, first of all, so I'm not going to claim it for myself, as a, one of those blurb things. But anyway, I mean, I guess a jeweler's eye is looking for the detail. And I've always stressed looking for the universal and the particular, the detail that says something larger. The birder's ear is that rhythm of life, not just of conversation, but a rhythm of a life. And the detective is, the joy that we all have going into archives and slogging through a full day's worth of research, but finding that one bit of gold in it. There's no feeling quite like that. So that's what those apply to, I guess.
Okay, well, thank you. Douglas, what is your writing process like? And have you outlined or storyboarded before you start writing, or do you begin the writing without that process?
Well, Charles Blow, a friend of mine at the New York Times, when he writes, he's convinced me talking to him that when you write a column, it's really smart to have an outline, because you're going to have to go A, B, C, D and nail it. And otherwise you get all twisted up. With a book, I try to do the chronology of what I'm trying to accomplish, as I mentioned, and then let the story go where it might. I think David said something very important of, like, you're looking for the gaps. Like if I'm writing on Rachel Carson, there have been a couple of distinguished biographies. I dabbled in the books, but I was scared to read them whole for the reason Stacy said. But I did start wanting to look, where are the gaps in the Rachel Carson story? How can I further advance Rachel Carson's studies? So I'm not just, removing the bones of history around and sometimes journalists do that more. Some journalists, not David, but some journalists will simply, get a book and then find the great thing in it and move on. But I'm always looking for what's not been said about Rachel Carson, what's not been said about the Santa Barbara oil spill. So I can feel other environmental historians after me might be able to footnote my book and say Brinkley brought something new to the table. And that seems to be important to me personally, because I came up as an academic historian, where you do undergrad, master's, doctorate, you got peer review, and that really matters in the academic world a lot, that you're bringing something new to the situation. The problem, Baldwin, I knew maybe this is useful, I'll condense the story, but a friend of mine went to University of Texas doing her dissertation, and instead of sticking to just Baldwin, she decided she was going to do existentialism in the work of Richard Wright, James Baldwin, Albert Murray, and she had like 10 different things. and she never got it done, although her research was spectacular because she had created this large thing. And I used to be the boring guy that would tell my friend, just do Baldwin, just do the book on James. That's too much thinking. And I'm sure with something like existential philosophy and Sartre and Camus, and I'm sure and she did have a genius thought, but putting that on the paper can be really tough. And again, I think it's where you are in your writing career. If you're doing your first book, get it done. And don't be afraid of university presses. A lot of them have great biographies of unusual people. I just went up to St. Joseph's University of Minnesota, where there's a Eugene McCarthy Center. David, you love politics so much. I never understood Eugene McCarthy till I went to his and met the Benedictine monks at the monastery up there at St. John's in Collegeville, Minnesota. And suddenly I understood, Eugene McCarthy in a way. So I think traveling and keeping your focus. We live in a pragmatic world, and you ask when you know you're done. Well, there are deadlines. I mean, you sign a contract, it's due. Now you might be able to blow that up and say, I'm not done and I need another year. And, I had a problem. But that's not a good professional form. I mean, if you're going to sign a contract, you're trying to meet your deadline. And that starts informing the rush at the end to get it done, and realize you are not the last person to write on James Baldwin. There will be books after you, and maybe 5 years from now or 20 years from now. So you're just part of a Baldwin, pecking order.
Absolutely. One of the lovely things about biography is it does, in a sense, feel like a collective enterprise that way. I want to turn back to the mechanics of writing for 1 second. I have a question for you, Stacey. It's kind of about the mechanics and the rhetoric of writing biography in particular. When you're writing about these gaps that you've all referenced, I mean, what kinds of tips do you have? I mean, there's always that biographical tick of they must have, right? Or I imagine that they did. But what kinds of tips do you have, like on the level of the sentence, even for kind of writing about these gaps in ways that open it up, don't assume too much, but also don't shut it down?
It's a great question. Let me just launch from where Doug just ended up. Not only are you hoping to bring something original, but you're looking for what your subject tried to throw away. I mean, I can't think of anything that is more catnip to the biographer than what his or her subject crossed out. And, I had this with the Salem witch trials. There's a sermon notebook by the minister in whose house the witchcraft breaks out. In no sermon is there anything ever crossed out, but the sermon from January 1692 that he speaks probably just before his house convulsed in witchcraft. There are 11 lines that he's crossed out in a way that we can't read. They're completely obliterated. And I can't tell you the number of techniques I tried, the labs to which I sent these pages, which are in the Connecticut Historical Society, to try to see what he was crossing out. Anyway, so those are the things that, you're writing around what got excised from the record, which is often more telling than what got left on the record. I think it's really liberating to be able to say on the page, we can't know, or we don't know. And obviously we all have used the must-haves, the could-haves, the probablys. Cleopatra dies. We know this to be this no historical fact. How does she die? We have two accounts. They do not tally one with the other. In fact, they contradict each other in many points. And at a certain point, I realized the only way to kill her was to let her die twice, was to let her die in one account and then have her die all over again in the other account. And to know that both of these accounts, both of them written long after she does die, are no doubt faulty, but they're the only accounts we have. And to basically couch these facts for the reader. And in that book, I really backed up and gave a lot of who the chroniclers were so that you knew that you were reading accounts that were tendentious or biased or faulty, or at least by no means contemporaneous, so that you knew you were reading something that had always around it a laurel of myth in some way, or a laurel of imperfection. And I think it's one way to do it. I think you're asking yourself, or you're meant to be inside someone else's head. And I don't think most of us can do that for the people with whom we live day after day, or ourselves for that matter. So it's a very humbling exercise. And I just think being able to admit that you're dealing in imperfections is probably the best antidote, in short, to your extremely good question.
I wrote a book that is not quite a biography, but it's about my family and especially about my father and his experiences in the McCarthy era. And I was never able to interview him about that. So of course, who knows what was going through his head during the most traumatic period of his life. And I really believe that just being honest about what you don't know is a blessing to the writer and to the reader. And if you do that in a totally upfront, honest way, it allows you to explore without pretending that you know. So that's what I've always tried to do. And I think it's the only honest way to do it.
I'm also not sure the reader really wants necessarily to be handed the answer. I think the reader wants to know, what are the options here?
Mhm.
That's fascinating, this idea of, I'm sorry, Douglas, did you want to add something?
No, go ahead.
That this idea of presenting the death twice, and it relates to Megan Marshall's talk yesterday, right? About, and it also relates to this idea of how to gracefully bring things together in the end. Not that every biography must, as we've discussed on various panels, must end with the death of the subject. But I am interested, because you can't start with how you bring it gracefully together. You have to kind of go back and think about, and this is my question leading up to it, how do you carve a narrative through line through the book out of all the research and notebook material? Stacey, you talked a little bit about this. How do you carve that through line? To get to that graceful ending? I mean,
I think of the word seamless. I'm trying to write the book to be a seamless narrative. That and so you're constantly when you introduce new people into the narrative, I try to introduce them early. So first mention, give a little bit of background. It immediately recognize, are they going to reappear a lot, that person, or is this a one-off anecdote? If they're going to appear throughout the book and have meaning for the later chapters, sometimes I'll stick them into middle chapters, maybe where they just don't quite belong. An example, a guy named Norman Cousins, who used to be the editor of the Saturday Review, and I'm writing about Cousins being against the nuclear weapons in my current book. And then with Jack Kennedy, he became the emissary, the diplomatic plenipotentiary for the nuclear test ban treaty. He did shuttle diplomacy as a private citizen to meet with Khrushchev. Well, I have a great bit about him at Earth Day in 1970, but then after 63, I didn't have him in the book anymore. So I found a way to stick him in the 60s on a protest about smog in New York City, just so I kept the name Norman Cousins a little bit alive in the book, because there'd be a payoff coming at the end of the book. So he was big at the beginning, big at the end. I realized I didn't have a great middle for him, so I made an attempt to keep him in. And then when you get too many characters, you almost need a cast of characters, particularly if you're starting to do family genealogy and who's the father, and you're starting to do immigrant roots or something on this. And I'm always worried that the reader's going to get lost in a sea of names. And do you want to make a cast of characters, or you have to be very important that anytime a name appears in the book, the reader will remember who that person is?
Death isn't necessarily the end of the book. I actually wrote 2 biographies about presidents who are still alive, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And I hate moving targets. So I knew that I wasn't going to write about anything beyond anything about their presidencies, because they were still presidents at the time. So I had to pick different places to end the books. And they really were, in each case, defined by what I wanted that book to be. So my book about Obama was really about 2 things: the world that created him, this incredible random world that created Barack Obama, and then how he recreated himself. And he really recreated himself before he got into politics. It was the 8 years that he spent in college, and right after that, trying to figure himself out with all of the contradictions of his life. So I end that book with him driving up to Harvard Law School. And even though there's a whole nother political book to be written, that's the book I wanted to write. With Bill Clinton, his whole life was politics. But again, I didn't want to write a moving subject. So I ended that book with him singing Amazing Grace on the night that he won his election. It's all over right there. I mean, no, the night he announced for president. I'm sorry. I didn't even go into the election itself. So, for each book, you have to make that decision, that part of it ahead of time. I didn't know exactly what the ending would be, but I knew when I would end it.
I would also say that we don't always begin in childhood.
Yes.
And maybe that's just because I don't really particularly like writing childhoods, because I feel like they're concocted, they're kind of, retrofitted afterwards to fit the life in some way. And often the only thing you have for the childhood is your subject's own words, which are by definition faulty in some way or incomplete in some way. But that the childhood often comes into play only insofar as it's important to the subject. And in a case where it's not important, it isn't necessarily a place in which you want to dwell for many, many pages.
Which was the case with Cleopatra.
Cleopatra was a problem because there was no childhood in the ancient world, right? I would have loved to have had Cleopatra's child. Yeah.
Before we transition to questions in about 3 minutes, I wanted to ask each of you, one of the things about writing a biography is there's no school for it, right? That's what's so great about bio is that it's a place for biographers to come together. Do you have books? Of course, Robert Caro wrote Working, which is terrific. For me personally, actually, Vivian Gornick's book, The Situation and the Story, has sort of taught me something about how to write nonfiction narrative and translate it into a biographical work. But are there sources that you have read, maybe Hermione Lee, I'm not sure, on biography that have helped you in writing your wonderful books?
I would say that Leon Adele's Writing Lives was for me the best start to writing biography. And I think every time I have briefly gone back to it, I'm wowed all over again. But that insofar as a handbook to the rules of biography might go, that would be my nomination.
Yeah, thank you. Douglas or David?
I just say there's a guy named, there's books on writing well, more than just on the art of biography. I've never fallen, Nigel Hamilton did a good book on biography that I was interested in, because Nigel, I'm very puritanical about dealing with people's sex lives. You're dealing with Baldwin, you may have to deal with that some, and I'm always like, no, I don't want to. And Nigel kind of took a Freudian psycho-biographical way of looking at things in a book he wrote about it, about John F. Kennedy or Bill Clinton or people like this. And it's not my cup of tea. I still don't care about the sex life of Rachel Carson for what I'm trying to do. I know that's a weakness in my character, and I'm trying that reminding myself that I might have to dabble there a little bit. Certainly, if you're writing on somebody like Kennedy and Clinton, you got to, because it becomes part of their public careers in such a large way. But and then Hunter S. Thompson, a friend of mine, used to take good writing and just type it. He was young, and he would take Great Gatsby and just type it over and over again to learn the rhythm. And I think I talked to Maureen Dowd once about this, that their book's probably behind me, that if I want to get in a writing mood, I'd still turn to Thomas Wolfe, the great novelist. He just still inspires me a lot. Or, you pick up Truman Capote, and by reading some good writing, it might get you in a mood for writing your own good pages, because you see that high quality. If you don't get discouraged that they're so good and whatever you do is going to be subpar. And it's a little bit of a trick.
I taught a course on political biography at Vanderbilt this semester. And the first thing I had them read was Working by Robert Caro. Yeah. But then for their final papers, one wrote a final paper about Cleopatra by Stacy Schiff, and the other wrote about Rosa Parks by Douglas Brinkley, just coincidentally, and they both got A's. So
there we go.
But I when I look for inspiration, I read other stuff. I don't read anything about how to write a biography. I'll maybe read Orwell's essays or something like that. Try to, just to be reminded of what good, clear writing is.
And, with Orwell, once, for example, I keep in mind, he used to, as a reporter, really dog Mahatma Gandhi all the time. And, just negative writing about Gandhi. And then Gandhi was assassinated. And Orwell wrote, now that Gandhi's gone, I've been a critic of him. I realized what a clean smell he left behind. Mm-hmm. And that sticks to my mind. Like if you're writing a biography of Jimmy Carter, you're saying, well, Carter was a one-term president. He was failed. But you're looking towards the end of his life and say, well, what an ethical person he was in the end. And it might encourage you to not be afraid to return to what's great about Baldwin at the end of the book. So you're not dealing with the writer in decline, and then that's the end, you know.
Excellent point. So I feel like we have a lot of people here and a lot of questions. So I feel like I'm just going to start to read some of them out loud, and people can continue to send them over. I'll just start pretty early on. After you have written parts or much or all of your book, do you parcel it out to friends and colleagues to read and give you feedback? That is, before you submit it to your editor and publisher. And are there risks in doing that?
Well, my wife reads everything I write chapter by chapter. Sometimes she'll say, well, David, I just don't get this. And it sounds sexist, but it's not. And then I'll say, well, that's because you just don't get it. But then every time I'll go back and change it because she's always right. I also, unlike many writers, I actually, for my first 12 and a half books, I had Alice Mayhew as my editor. And I would send her a few chapters at a time all the way through the book so that she knew how it was shaping and what shape it was in. She never line edited. Once in a while, she'd have a suggestion, but I wanted her to be part of that process. As for other people, it's very important to have experts read your book. So for my Thorpe book, it was incredibly important for Native Americans to read the book, and I had that, and for Olympic experts. So I'm always looking for people that can save me, from some embarrassment, and who know some of the subjects better than I do. And that's how I do it, but not until the end. I don't send chapters out to anybody but my wife and my editor.
David makes an extraordinary, this is a great question, by the way, whoever sent this in, because I'm living it right now. It is, I think David's right, wait till you're done and then fire off chapters, but it's humiliating because if you're sending people an unedited chapter, you're so embarrassed that and then you're giving it to the expert who's going to say, are you kidding? You know nothing about it. I'm writing about endangered species, sending it to a biologist, and I'm embarrassed because I know how professional they are. They're going to see all of my weaknesses. But I would live by one rule: get the error out of the book as quickly as you can. Once you get a first draft, get rid of error. There's only one document. They're not 4 manuscripts. There's one that's going to get submitted, that's going to get printed in some factory, and get error out of the book. And if I have one issue, it's just, as a historian, nothing makes me more ill than getting an email from somebody that I have a mistake in my book. I'm so embarrassed because I feel my professionalism demands that it's fully fact vetted, and that's a process. And as I get older, it's tiring because you've got to go FedEx it, or then ask them, or and particularly if you're sending an entire manuscript to somebody to read, you're telling somebody, I'm not paying you, and I'd like you though to take 20 hours out of your life to go look at my manuscript, and it's always, it's not my favorite phase, but it is essential for a good book. Heavy vetting.
Stacy?
I, like David, my husband reads every chapter as I write it, the poor soul, and then sends me into a tailspin because, of course, he must be wrong about what he has to say, and he's always right. So clearly, we're married to the same person. And I have a novelist friend who reads chapters at the same time. Very, very different reader. One is really reading for logic, and one is largely reading for style and flow and character. And I don't submit to my editor on the assumption that an editor can only read with fresh eyes so many times. And that's the one thing I would say in terms of tips of the trade. Don't overtax your editor, because you kind of want them to see you at your best. So overtax your friend or your partner or your dog or whomever. But, an editor, I think, can really only read something fresh a few times. And so I like that to be when I'm pretty close to the finish line.
What a great point.
That's great. That's very helpful. I want to get to some more questions, but I did see, I'm going to break my own rule here. I saw that Kitty Kelly had a question very early, but she didn't post it. She tried to raise her hand, and if she's still here, I'd like to give her the opportunity to ask that question.
Hi, Kitty.
Is she still here? Oh, I'm so sorry. But we'll see if she comes back. So this is from someone, while chronology is important, just to get back to that topic we were discussing, I'd like to hear a discussion of the weight of narrative, the story of the life, in contrast to the chronology, the difference between chronology and history. Or I guess another way of putting this is how you integrate historical background, into kind of the propulsion of a narrative that a biography needs.
That's such a great question. Sorry, did I just interrupt someone?
No.
I just was going to say quickly that since I know we're running short, sometimes you have to step aside and insert the necessary context or the historical chapters that in a funny way your subject is not privy to or part of. And there, I guess my quick and dirty answer would be you try to fit that in at a point where you have the reader's interest anyway, or you've left your reader at a precipice, and now you can slip off and slip in the Roman Civil Wars, for example, or something that would otherwise qualify as broccoli, and fit that into the narrative, and then sort of pick things up where you left off. I mean, with the witchcraft book, I realized that I've been talking about witchcraft for 50 pages, and I'd never explained what witchcraft was and what the tradition of witchcraft entailed, and I was going to have to essentially put 20 pages on the history of witchcraft into the book somewhere. So, you need to kind of get your action moving, I think, before you can buy the reader's patience for that kind of exegesis. That's
and then just follow up and say, do you insert that historical background later, or do you do it as you're writing the draft? Like, do you say, oh, I'm going to stop here and do the history and come back? Or is it something that you add later?
I don't think you could, go ahead, Stacey.
Yeah,
No, I was going to say, let someone else take that one. Go ahead.
I would never go back and insert it later. I think it has to be organic and part of the narrative process. And a lot of the fun of writing biography or history of any sort is figuring out the connections between the central line of the story and everything that connects to it in different ways. I love to do that. So whether it's writing about the history and the awfulness of the Indian boarding schools, connecting that to Jim Thorpe's experience at Carlisle Indian School, or writing about the inception of football, and the early days of the brutality of early football. There's so many different other themes that come through a life that are really the fun of it as much as anything else.
I very briefly, I would just say we got to keep in mind the time that we're writing our biography. I think right now it's very important. We've been living through Black Lives Matter, Me Too. We're having a relook at gender, race in America, sexuality. And so, you've got to constantly remind yourself, like I'm writing on the environment, but I've been very weak on Native American history in my own narrative now. And I'm realizing I must, but when you're dealing with land and water and all, it get way out of control, just like writing the history of witchcraft can get way out of control. So in this particular case, I waited on Native American history towards I had my first draft, and then said, okay, what was the First Peoples experience under Kennedy? What was it under Lyndon Johnson? And what was it under Nixon? And did do those as inserts later. Because I didn't want to write too much at the time because it would overwhelm my book. I mean, if you're dealing with the genocide in the history of Native people, it can just take over an entire book. And so in that one regard, waited till I had a draft and then inserted. Not the best way to do it, but it's the one I felt I had to do that I didn't overwrite in early up.
There is no best way to do it. And that's the point of all of this, there's only the way you can do it. That's the best way to do it.
Well, I'm glad you guys brought up that topic. It relates to, I think, what may be close to our final question from Ellen Short, which is, what are some important ethical considerations to keep in mind when writing about subjects who are culturally different from the author? For example, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religion, et cetera. This is, of course, something that I've thought about a lot myself, writing about James Baldwin. David, maybe in terms of Jim Thorpe, we can get very specific here. You sort of referenced this earlier. How has that question influenced the writing?
It was the first question I dealt with, Nicholas. I mean, before I decided to write the book, I wrote to the head of the Indigenous Studies at Northwestern University and said, I'm thinking of writing about Jim Thorpe. What do you think? And if she had said, don't do it, I wouldn't have done it, honestly. Then the second person I talked to was Susan Sean Harjo, one of the leaders of the Indian movement in Washington, D.C. And so I really immersed myself there before I did anything else. And I think that was very important. I mean, my style of writing is empathetic anyway. I believe deeply that writers should feel free to write about anything in this world. We're all human beings, but I try to approach it with a honest but empathetic perspective.
Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to that book. Does anybody else have anything to add to that question?
I just think it's so wonderful that we have our group bio, and that we're able to get together like this. And it's been a wonderful organization to be involved with. And if anybody has any questions of me or I can be of help, I'm at Rice University, and just it's a public email, and hit me up, and I'd love to stay in touch with some of you.
Thank you very much, Douglas. I think we have time for one more question if Kitty is out there, but I don't think she is. Do either of our panelists have a sort of a closing question that they think hasn't been addressed, or something that was important, an important tip or trick that you learned along the way in your career that we haven't covered yet?
There are so many good questions in the chat. I wish we could be here for another hour. Does anyone have a trick about a secret for source notes and how you do them as you work? Because that, I think, is something common. Exactly my point. It's just a risible question, right?
I'm a complete failure.
Me too. Okay, so who's the success story here?
Is Kai right here? Is Kai right here? Because I believe that this is one of his specialties.
Maybe we could have a session on one.
Yeah, no, I know people who are great at it and do it as they write. I cannot do it as I'm writing. It
interrupts the flow of the work.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Oh, no. You do it as you write.
No, you don't, Kai.
What are you doing
You
here?
can,
Kai?
I can't.
Hey,
Well,
Kai, how are you?
That's what I do.
Yeah, I know great writers who do it that way, but I end up spending 2 months at the end just beating myself up.
The academics tend to do it that way. People with an academic background tend to they're less interested in narrative flow and very interested in sourcing, perhaps more than a creative biographer is. So there's a kind of schism between popular history and academic on that approach. Kai does them both, but I think Kai's more in the academic tradition.
Whose dog is that?
That's my dog. It's a Great Pyrenees who just got loose. Sorry.
Thanks to Kai's advice, I've been making myself do it at the end of every big chunk. But I understand Stacey's point. You're in this sort of emotional journey. You can't break it up. So I really wait until there's a pause in the action.
I mean, I insert these sort of incipient notes as I'm going, so I have it sourced, but there is always, once one finishes, one then unscrambles the egg, and it's, very hard. There are always 20 mysteries at the end. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you all for all the panelists and everybody for joining us. Kai for his cameo, and now we know we will have hopefully a panel next year about source notes among so many other fascinating panels, I'm sure. Thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicholas. Thanks, David. Thanks, Doug. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bio.